Hi, this is Chris Moretti, and over the next 10 minutes I'll be giving a short guide to reading and working with court decisions for politics students. In this video I'll be looking at how to identify the winner of a case. I'll assume some prior knowledge from previous videos. The first thing to point out is that court decisions are quite long. The average UK Supreme Court decision is about 8,000 words. It's not just 8,000 words, it's 8,000 words putting down some complex arguments, particularly if you are not familiar with the law. And because court decisions are long and complex, it's helpful to be able to have shortcuts to identify who came out on top of a decision. And the first shortcut that you want to use as a guide to your understanding, as a precursor to reading the full text of the decision, are the press summaries put out by the court. So many apex courts, or courts at the top of their judicial hierarchy, they prepare summaries of their decisions. And if I can take the UK Supreme Court as an example, their press summaries are absolutely wonderful. They're rarely longer than 2 pages. And they'll summarise the legal details in ways which are accessible to someone who's interested in the law but not expert in it. And you can find these press summaries by just going into the page for any decision, scrolling down, and beneath the judgment you'll find the PDF containing the summary of the decision. For other courts, you don't exactly get a press summary, but you might get a short review of the main holdings in the case. So this is the way that the Supreme Court of the United States works. They don't give press summaries, but they give what are called head notes. And these are written for lawyers, and so they're not as user-friendly, but they'll give the factual background to the case, what the court held, and then most importantly for us, a description of the outcome using 2 particular forms of words. So either the lower court decision is vacated and remanded, that's to say the appellants win and the court overturns the lower court's decision, which is vacated, or affirmed. So the original decision is affirmed and the current appellants lose. So if you were interpreting that decision, you'd work out, okay, who's appealing in this case, what do they want, and then what was the outcome, did they get what they wanted or not. If you don't have a press summary or a head note, you probably want to start reading the judgment from the bottom up. You might need to skip past some dissenting opinions or concurring opinions. I'll talk about that more later. And the particular form of words that you're looking for is some indication that the appeal was granted or allowed. So UK courts allow appeals. In the rest of the world, appeals are typically granted. Alternately, you might be looking for a form of words which says that the appeal was dismissed or rejected. So that's for appeals cases like you might find in a Supreme Court. In first instance cases, you'd be looking for words like the claimant succeed in their case, or otherwise the claimant's case must be dismissed or rejected. There can be cases where a plaintiff or an appellant wins formally, but doesn't get the kind of outcome that they wanted. So I've cited here a case that I discuss in my book on the UK Supreme Court called A Court of Specialists. And the case involves a guy called Lumba, and he was appealing ultimately a decision of the Home Office. So here's what I said about that case. Mr. Lumba had brought a case against the Home Department challenging his detention. His argument was that the Secretary of State had been operating with 2 policies. There was one published policy which said that all reasonable alternatives to detention must be considered before detention is authorised. and a second unpublished policy which in practice required detention for all foreign national prisoners. So this argument was successful because Mr. Lumba won his appeal. The court said that the Secretary of State couldn't have an unpublished policy operating alongside a published policy. And so for that reason, the particular way in which Mr. Lumba was imprisoned was wrong. However, although Mr. Lumba had been wrongfully imprisoned, the court found that if you instead took the published policy, he would also have been imprisoned. So in this case, Mr. Lumba's main argument didn't matter for how he was treated. So a majority of the court awarded him nominal damages of £1. But this didn't change the decision to deport Mr. Lumba. A second kind of complication is where there are cases which have multiple grounds. So I've, up until this point, been assuming that a party either wins the appeal or loses it, or wins the case or loses the case. But that's not always true. Sometimes litigants can advance several different issues and they can win some and lose on others. So if I take you back to the High Court libel case involving Peter Cruddas that I mentioned in an earlier video, in that case there were multiple issues relating to the meaning of what some Sunday Times journalists had written about Peter Cruddas and the interpretation given to that. So one issue was whether the journalists implied that Cruddas had engaged in criminal corruption, or whether they'd implied that he had engaged in corrupt behaviour which was not necessarily criminal. And so here the journalists were successful in one part of their appeal. The court did agree that Cruddas's behaviour had been corrupt. However, the court also found that a number of reasonable readers might wrongly interpret the articles as implying also criminal corruption, which was not the case. Cruddas hadn't committed criminal corruption. And so because of that, although the journalists were successful in one part of their case, they were ultimately liable for libel. The last complicating issue is in cases in constitutional or rights courts where petitioners will advance multiple different rights claims, and so the question will not be whether they succeeded or lost, but the question will be, did the court find a violation of each challenged right? So that hopefully will give you an overview of how to identify the winners of different court cases.